Hello. What if I told you that stupidity isn't simply the absence of intelligence, but something far more insidious, a force capable of transforming brilliant minds into instruments of destruction? What if the greatest threat facing civilization isn't evil people doing evil things, but an unthinking society that has simply stopped thinking? Picture this. A renowned scientist with multiple degrees suddenly begins believing and spreading dangerous misinformation. A compassionate teacher starts endorsing harmful ideologies. A loving parent begins making decisions that endanger their own children. These aren't evil people. They are intelligent, well-meaning individuals who have fallen victim to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the power of stupidity. And here is what makes this truly terrifying. This isn't something that happens to other people. It's happening to people just like you and me. This is not mere philosophical speculation. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted his infamous obedience experiments at Yale University. Ordinary volunteers were instructed by an authority figure to administer what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing screams of agony, 65% of participants continued delivering shocks they believed could be lethal. These were not sadists or mentally disturbed individuals. They were ordinary people who had temporarily surrendered their capacity for independent moral judgment. This is precisely what Bonhoeffer witnessed firsthand in Nazi Germany, and it led him to develop one of the most unsettling theories about human nature ever conceived. But before we go deeper, I must ask, have you ever found yourself believing something simply because everyone around you believed it too? Keep that question in mind as we explore what may be one of the most important psychological insights of the modern era. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not a typical philosopher cloistered in an ivory tower, pondering abstract ideas. He was a German Lutheran pastor who watched his entire society transform before his eyes. Born in 1906 into an intellectual family, his father was a prominent psychiatrist and neurologist. Bonhoeffer had every reason to believe in the power of education and rational discourse. Yet, as the Nazi Party rose to power, Bonhoeffer witnessed something that shattered his faith in human rationality. He watched as educated, cultured, and religious German citizens began supporting policies and leaders that contradicted everything they claimed to stand for. These were not ignorant masses being manipulated by clever propaganda. They were professors, doctors, clergy members, and intellectuals who were actively participating in their own intellectual surrender. While awaiting execution in 1943 for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote from prison what has become his most haunting observation. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. What made this observation so chilling was not only its context, but its precision. Evil, Bonhoeffer argued, always carries within itself the seeds of its own undoing. It generates unease, resistance, and eventual collapse. But stupidity believes it is doing good, which makes it absolutely immune to correction. Perhaps Bonhoeffer's most prescient insight concerned how stupidity serves existing power structures. Malicious people know they are doing wrong, which creates internal conflict and eventual breakdown. But people caught in functional stupidity believe they are doing good, making them completely resistant to correction. This is no accident. Those in power no longer need to actively suppress information. They need only create conditions in which processing information honestly becomes prohibitively difficult. When Bonhoeffer used the word stupidity, he was not referring to low intelligence or lack of education. He was describing something far more complex, what we might call functional stupidity or willful ignorance. In his letters from prison, he explained, "The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent." In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans and catchphrases that have taken possession of him. What made Bonhoeffer's theory so revolutionary was this. He argued that stupidity often emerges not from individual failings, but from systemic pressures that make thinking independently both difficult and costly. The truth is, our economic systems actively incentivize intellectual shortcuts. Social media platforms earn billions when users react emotionally rather than think critically. News outlets attract more clicks with outrage than with nuance. Politicians win elections with simple slogans rather than complex policy proposals. When people are working multiple jobs, drowning in debt, and constantly bombarded with information, intellectual surrender becomes a survival strategy. What economists call rational ignorance emerges. It becomes more efficient for individuals to remain uninformed about complex issues than to invest the time and energy required for genuine understanding. Yet this individual rationality produces collective irrationality, exactly the dynamic Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany. The result is not merely individual choice, it is structural pressure toward intellectual surrender. And our stressed, overwhelmed brains are perfectly designed to comply. While economic systems push us toward intellectual shortcuts, our brains are also wired to follow along. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s revealed exactly how this works psychologically. When people encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, their brains fight to reject it. But here is what Bonhoeffer understood and modern psychology has since confirmed. This process intensifies when people are stressed, overwhelmed, or economically insecure, precisely the conditions our current systems create. Bonhoeffer observed that stupidity tends to emerge in group settings. He wrote, "It becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one." He noted that perfectly rational individuals abandon their critical thinking abilities once they become part of a larger group or movement. This insight was decades ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s demonstrated exactly what Bonhoeffer had witnessed. When surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of people went along with the crowd at least once, even when they knew the group was wrong. Now consider how this plays out in the digital age. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that make this transformation easier than ever before. A 2018 study by MIT researchers found that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social platforms. But here is the critical insight. This is because false information often provides more emotional satisfaction than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that confirms their worldview, they are participating in a system that rewards intellectual shortcuts over careful analysis. The algorithm feeds them more of the same, creating echo chambers that function like intellectual quicksand. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to show you exactly what you want to see? That is no accident. It is the architecture of chosen ignorance in action. We see this pattern repeat itself throughout history. The Salem witch trials were not conducted by evil people, but by God-fearing community members who genuinely believed they were protecting their neighbors, people who considered themselves good. The Red Scare of the 1950s was not driven by malicious actors, but by patriotic Americans who sincerely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, intelligent, educated people abandoned careful thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional certainty. So if our brains and our systems are working against us, how do we fight back? Bonhoeffer believed that breaking free from stupidity requires what he called costly grace, the willingness to think independently, even when it is painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But we now understand that we are not merely fighting social pressure. We are fighting millions of years of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts with surgical precision. On an individual level, we can cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and potentially wrong. This means actively seeking out information that contradicts our beliefs, not to torment ourselves, but to test whether our beliefs are worth holding. Here are some concrete practices that can serve as your daily resistance against intellectual surrender. First, practice intellectual friction. Set aside time each week to read thoughtful arguments from people who disagree with you, not necessarily to change your mind, but to test whether your convictions can withstand scrutiny. Second, embrace productive ignorance. When you find yourself absolutely certain about something, ask, what evidence would change my mind? If you cannot think of any, that is a red flag. Third, slow down your sharing. Before posting anything online, take 60 seconds to verify it from an independent source. That brief pause can break the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our emotional reactions. Finally, make a habit of saying, I don't know, when you genuinely don't know. In a world that rewards confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting gaps in your knowledge becomes a radical act. But individual practices are not enough. We also need structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding. This means requiring social media platforms to disclose their algorithmic biases and how they curate content. It means funding comprehensive public media literacy campaigns that teach people how to evaluate sources and evidence. It means designing online platforms that reward intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most importantly, we need economic policies that reduce the stress and uncertainty that make people vulnerable to intellectual shortcuts. When people are not constantly worried about healthcare, housing, and employment, they have more mental bandwidth for careful thinking about complex issues. Bonhoeffer's theory was brilliant for its time, but here is what he could not have known. This is not only about moral surrender or social pressure. Modern neuroscience reveals something far more unsettling. Our brains are, in a sense, wired to fall into functional stupidity. Consider this. Bonhoeffer witnessed Nazi propaganda spreading through newspapers and radio broadcasts. But we are living through something exponentially more dangerous. We have moved from Nazi propaganda to social media algorithms that know exactly which psychological buttons to push, and now we are entering the age of AI-generated deepfakes capable of fabricating reality itself. The threat is not merely escalating, it is targeting the very architecture of human cognition. This is not just about Nazis or propaganda, it is about how your brain works. Our minds evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, and to seek information that confirms what we already believe. These were survival features that helped our ancestors make rapid decisions in an era when hesitation could mean death. The most frightening part, no matter how intelligent we believe ourselves to be, unfortunately, we are all vulnerable. The mechanism corresponds precisely to what Bonhoeffer described. When people feel threatened and uncertain, they become more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations that reduce complexity to simple narratives. But here is the critical insight that makes Bonhoeffer's warning more urgent than ever. We are no longer dealing only with human manipulation. We face systems designed by artificial intelligence to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is being analyzed and weaponized against our capacity for independent thought. We witness this in real time during COVID-19. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with demonstrated analytical abilities, began sharing debunked theories about vaccines and treatments. These were not failures of intelligence, they were failures of intellectual independence. Under unprecedented pressure, Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence. He was executed by hanging on April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. According to a fellow prisoner, his last words were, "This is the end, for me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice was not merely about political resistance, It was about defending the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking independently, they cease to be fully human. In his words, they become puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be the strongest at any given moment. But here is what makes Bonhoeffer's final challenge so relevant today. Who stands fast? When the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when independent thinking requires courage, when the cost of truth is higher than the price of comfortable lies, who stands fast? The answer is not found in superior intelligence or education. It is found in the daily choice to remain curious rather than certain, to seek truth rather than comfort, to think carefully rather than react quickly. These are not heroic acts. They are ordinary practices that become extraordinary when everyone around you has stopped performing them. The tragedy is that intellectual surrender often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It is uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It is painful to admit you might be wrong about something important. But Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of remaining human. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think for ourselves becomes a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. We are all vulnerable to functional stupidity. The moment we believe we are immune, we have already begun to succumb. The price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when thinking becomes difficult. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity is unsettling precisely because it is so accurate. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believing obviously false things, educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions, well-meaning citizens supporting policies that contradict their own values. The problem is not that people are becoming less intelligent. It is that our systems increasingly reward intellectual shortcuts over careful thinking. But within this sobering diagnosis lies genuine hope. If stupidity is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. Though will a person ever truly accept that? If it is partly structural, structures can be changed. If it is the result of cognitive overwhelm, we can create conditions that make thinking easier rather than harder. Think of critical thinking like physical exercise. It is uncomfortable at first, but essential for strength. Just as we would not expect to run a marathon without training, we cannot expect to navigate complex information without practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles required for independent thought need regular use. Otherwise, they atrophy. The next time you find yourself absolutely certain about something, the next time you catch yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without consideration, the next time you feel the comfort of having all the answers, remember Bonhoeffer's warning. Functional stupidity does not announce itself with fanfare. It whispers that you already know everything you need to know. And in that moment of recognition, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind for the comfort of certainty, or will you choose the more difficult path of intellectual independence? The question Bonhoeffer leaves us with is not whether we are smart enough to avoid stupidity. It is whether we are committed enough to keep thinking when thinking becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think carefully and independently becomes one of the most important things we can do. In this video, I leave you with this challenge. Find one belief you hold strongly and spend 30 minutes researching the best arguments against it. Not to torment yourself, not to become paralyzed by doubt, but to practice the art of distinguishing between conviction and truth. If your belief survives honest scrutiny, you will hold it more confidently. If it does not, you will have learned something valuable about the difference between certainty and reality. The future of human dignity may well depend on how we collectively answer Bonhoeffer's challenge. If this video has made you question something you thought you knew for certain, that is not a weakness. It is the beginning of intellectual courage. Share it with someone who is not afraid to think deeply, even when it is uncomfortable, because in a world designed to profit from our intellectual surrender, the simple act of thinking carefully becomes the most important form of resistance we have. And remember, every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, careful thinking over quick reactions, you are not merely protecting your own mind. You are defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age of artificial stupidity. Which belief are you willing to question this week? Share it in the comments, and let us commit together to being the kind of people who stand fast when everyone else has stopped thinking. See you in the next video.